Okay, hi, welcome. Uh, I'm Robert Green. This is week 2 of History 358. This week we're going to be talking about politics. Um, we're going to talk about the range of political alternatives that emerged in Russia at the end of the 19th, early 20th century, alternatives to the existing autocratic system that we spoke of and read about in week 1. So as you'll recall from last week, we talked about the Russian Empire as a multi-ethnic, multi-confessional, that is multi-religious empire that rested on very shaky foundations. An empire that was divided along fault lines of religion, class, ethnic and national identity. And we talked about sort of the key social groupings that existed in the Russian population, the empire's population, at the turn of the 20th century. We talked about the peasants, we talked about the educated, urban, professional class. We talked also about the rising class of industrial workers, the proletariat, to use the Marxist phrase. This last class, of course, rather new on the scene, created, if you will, as a consequence of Russia's drive toward industrialization in the last decades of the 19th century. Each of these groups, as I mentioned last week, was dissatisfied, discontented with the autocratic system to one degree or another. And their dissatisfaction, their discontent, was grounded either in economic terms, or in political terms, or in both. You'll recall that the peasants wanted land. Their grievances with the autocratic system were primarily economic. The urban educated middle class that felt marginalized, that felt that they did not enjoy the same rights that their counterparts in Western Europe and across the Atlantic in the United States enjoyed, their grievances were primarily political. Remember, they were well pleased with an economic system of capitalism that had benefited them and worked to their advantage. The working class, the factory working class, as I mentioned last week, began to articulate their discontent in terms that were both economic and political. And what I want to do today in the first of these short lectures is just kind of sketch out the range, again, of political alternatives and how those modes of discontent that we talked about last week crystallize into political parties, political factions that will coalesce and challenge the autocratic system. And I should mention that, in our political system, we think of parties, the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, as something that is just a normal aspect of our political life. Political parties, organized, centralized agencies for the articulation and ideally the implementation of political views, are illegal in Tsarist Russia. The autocratic system has no desire to see political parties form. And so, again, Russia is an outlier here. All across Europe, certainly in the United States, at the turn of the 20th century, political parties are legal, they're above ground, they are the means through which men and increasingly women organize to press for their political demands. But in autocratic Russia, they are illegal. So I want to show you a very crudely rendered chart that I've put together. I'm not very good at PowerPoint, but I want to show you this chart that I think will allow us to visualize, to render in spatial terms, if you will, this range of political positions that existed in Imperial Russia, autocratic Russia, at the turn of the 20th century. And I'll sort of explain what I've done here. So if we imagine the political landscape divided into left and right, what I've done here is kind of show the various political parties that are forming in Russia after 1900 and kind of position them in such a way that you can see where they stand in relation to each other, where they stand in relation to the regime, the government. And also at the bottom, I've indicated the broad kind of political philosophical um, appellations or labels that we can apply to these various parties to kind of make sense of what they're talking about, what they want, what are their demands. So starting at the far left, actually, let me start right here. Now, this is not drawn to scale. This is only drawn, rendered, if you will, in relative terms again, right? But I put the regime here, headed by Nicholas II, right? The government, the state, the autocratic regime. We can describe it as traditional conservative. It wants to hold on to the existing political structures. It is not inclined toward reform, still less inclined towards radical revolutionary upheaval. And we can characterize it also using that term we talked about last week as autocratic. So if the regime is here, the regime's critics lie to the left. And we'll talk about those in turn. I'm not going to get into the Black Hundreds, although it's a fascinating topic, but I just wanted to point out that there is a political movement that emerges in early 20th century Russia that's even more reactionary, indeed, I would argue proto-fascist, pushing the regime to be more hardcore, pushing the regime to be more right-wing. This is a loose coalition of overtly nationalist, anti-Semitic factions that are loosely grouped under the name of the Black Hundreds. And there's various movements within that umbrella term, excuse me, of Black Hundreds. The League of the Russian People, the Union of Russian Salvation, the Union of the Archangel Michael. What they share in common is a almost fascist, that's why they're often characterized as proto-fascist or kind of pre-fascist, but they share this intensely nationalistic view of the Russian past. They argue that what made Russia great was the principles of autocracy, adherence to the Christian notions of the Orthodox faith, and the unity of the Russian people. So they're anti-Semitic, they're opposed to the Jews. They lead violent pogroms, violent acts of retribution against Jewish populations in the western part of the Russian Empire. They are against the extension of religious freedoms to the ethnic and religious minorities. They are against the extension of educational and employment opportunities. They really want to turn back the clock. And so the difference here, again, that's all I'm going to say about the Black Hundreds. There's a very interesting book by Walter LaCour on the Black Hundreds if you want to read more about them. But I just put them here to show that when we talk about the regime as traditional conservative, wanting to preserve, there's an even more radical position on the far right of the Russian political landscape at the turn of the 20th century that is trying to pull the regime in an even more reactionary direction. But I want to focus today on, this week rather, on this grouping of oppositional political movements, political parties that reject the principles of autocracy. And I'll talk about, in this short lecture, I'll talk about the socialist revolutionaries and the cadets. In the next lecture, I'll talk about the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, who are Marxists. And again, if we think about the spatial relationship represented here, they are all to the left of the regime. They are trying to, in some cases, pull the regime closer to their point of view. In other cases, when we get to the most radical of the left-wing parties, the Bolsheviks, they have no desire to pull the regime closer to them. They want to pull down the regime and create an entirely new social, political, and economic order. Now, obviously, in the course of 1917, the Marxists and the Bolsheviks in particular come out as the winners. So we're going to focus more on the Menshevik, more on the Marxists, and this week's readings focus on them. But the SRs, the Socialist Revolutionaries, and the cadets do play a role in the events of 1917. And just for kind of background sake, I want to talk a little bit about them today. Again, as questions come up, jot them down, email them to me. What I'd like to do in subsequent weeks is answer in these videos, at the beginning of the videos, the questions you've emailed me. So please do contact me with questions, if anything at all is unclear. So the leader of the SR party is a man named Viktor Chernov. The SRs, the Socialist Revolutionaries, are what we might think of as agrarian socialists. Now, what does that mean? What it means is that they look to the peasants as the agents of revolutionary change. And in a predominantly peasant country like Russia, that makes some sense. Those of you who took History 357 will recall the Slavophiles, the intellectual movement of the 1830s and 40s, who romanticized the peasant way of life, who romanticized the peasant mentality, the tendency toward collective action, the tendency toward communal responsibility. Out of the Slavophiles of the 1830s and 40s came the so-called populists of the 1870s and 80s, who went to the people, famously, in the 1870s. They left the cities and went to the village to teach the peasants, to instruct them in veterinary science and medicine, to lift them up out of their present economic woes, to lift them up out of ignorance and stand beside them to lead a revolution. Well, that didn't work out. When all these city slickers came to the village, the peasants freaked out. They didn't like this talk of atheism. They didn't like this talk of tearing down the czarist system and replacing it with something new. And the movement failed, and it failed horribly. When that movement failed, the populists regrouped and said, well, if we can't bring the people to revolution, we will act in their name. We will act on their behalf. And it was the people's will that assassinated Alexander II, as we talked about last week, in 1881. At the turn of the 20th century, in 1901, the Socialist Revolutionary Party was founded, again, led by Viktor Chernov, a lawyer from Moscow. Chernov had the challenging task of presiding over a party that was barely a party. When we think of parties, particularly in the European parliamentary context, we think of political organizations, political groupings that are fairly coherently organized along a guiding set of principles. The SRs are all over the place. Some of them say we should take bombs and blow up more czarist officials, more police chiefs, etc. And by explosive force, we can bring down the autocratic system and create something new. Others say, well, let's go back to the sort of gentle propagandizing days of the 1870s, teach the peasants, distribute pamphlets, gradually win them over to our side. So the SRs are divided terribly on the question of tactics. But what they agree on, again, is the central position that the peasants will be the agents of political change in Russia. Russia is a peasant country. Russia has always been a peasant country, and it will be the peasants and the SRs who will enact revolutionary change in Russia when the time is right. The principal plank of the SR party has to do with land. They want to take land from the landowners and redistribute it to the peasants. Now, this position is directly in line with the demands of the peasantry. As we saw last week, the peasants suffer from what was called at the time land hunger. Right? The peasants don't have enough land to support their families. They don't have enough land to feed the hungry mouths in the village. And so the SR position, if you sum it up in one word, is land. Take land from those who have it, give land to those who need it, i.e. the peasants. So the SRs are the peasant party. Their principal base of support is in the countryside. Peasants, to the extent that they identify with any political party, tended to identify with the SRs because the SR program of land redistribution meshed with the peasants' economic demands that we talked about last time. I want to talk briefly about the liberals. So let me go back just for a minute. So here we have again the SRs of whom we just spoke, agrarian socialists who see the future of Russia in the hands of the peasantry, who favor a program of land redistribution to give land and bread to the hungry peasants. In the middle here, we have the so-called cadets. The cadets are liberals. The Cadet Party is founded in 1904. The leader of the cadets is a man named Pavel Milyukov. We'll talk about Milyukov more in a minute. The liberals in Russia are very similar in terms of their demands to liberals all across Europe at this time. And those of you who've taken Western Civ or courses in political philosophy or modern European history know that liberalism as a political idea and as a political movement comes out of the Enlightenment of the 18th century. Liberals believe in rights. They favor what they call a rights-based discourse. They believe that rights are inalienable. Some liberals argue that rights come to us from the hand of God. Others, more secularly minded, argue that rights inhere unto individual persons by virtue of natural law. But the idea behind rights, as opposed to privileges, is that rights cannot be taken away. The government cannot come in and take away your rights. Individuals possess inalienable rights. And think of our own founding documents in this country that speak about inalienable rights, right? Rights that cannot be taken away. Privileges can be freely bestowed and just as freely taken away. So liberals are talking about rights. And liberals all across Europe, coming out of the Enlightenment tradition of the freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religious expression, argue that individuals possess these rights and governments need to recognize that. And only legitimate governments, or the only governments that are legitimate, are the governments that recognize and serve to uphold and defend individual rights to these inalienable qualities of the freedom of expression, freedom of communication, freedom of publication, freedom of speech, the right to organize, the right to have political expression heard. So the liberals in Europe and in Russia in the 19th and 20th century demand rights. Again, for those of you who remember the intellectual debates of the 1830s and 40s, if you took History 357, the liberals come out of that tradition of the so-called Westernizers, who look at the state of Russia today and say, something has to change. Let's look to the West for models. Let's look to the West for inspiration. And so in the 19th century and in the early 20th century, Russian liberals look to the West for inspiration. They read the writings of Western liberal thinkers, John Stuart Mill chief among them. They want a government that is elected by the people, that is responsible to the people. They want the right to free democratic elections, universal suffrage, the right for all men and for some liberals, even all women, to have their voice heard politically at the ballot box. They want governments that are responsive to the needs of the people, not aloof and indifferent, as a czarist autocracy can afford to be. So basically what the liberals would like, if you will, is to turn Russia into a really big Britain or France. They want to introduce into Russia those same kind of liberal systems and liberal structures that exist elsewhere. Again, they're looking at the West longingly and saying, why can't we have these things? Right? Why are we out in the cold? The leader of the liberal movement in the early 20th century is a man named Pavel Milyukov. He founds in 1904 the Constitutional Democratic Party, or the Cadet Party. And the name is very telling. Constitutional Democratic Party, liberals believing in rights, believing in elected governments that are responsive to the people who put them in power, put enormous faith in constitutions. We talked about constitutions last week. A constitution, again, is a binding legal document that lays out the power of the state. What can the government do? What can the government not do? What are the rights of the people that the government cannot take away? If you have this all down in paper, it becomes a lot easier to preserve those rights. And again, to sort of delineate the boundaries of political power in a given society. So we have to have a constitution. And the centrality of a constitution to the cadet position is enshrined in their very name, right? They are a constitutional democratic party. And the kind of system of government that they favor is entirely opposed to autocracy, which is a whimsical form of government depending on the preferences of whoever happens to be sitting on the throne at any given time. We can't have that. So Milyukov becomes the leader of the Russian liberal movement. He was the co-founder of the first liberal Russian newspaper titled Liberation. Liberation from what? Liberation from the tyranny of autocracy. Because of censorship laws in late Imperial Russia, the newspaper had to be published abroad in Germany, in the city of Stuttgart, and the copies were smuggled across the border and sold and distributed to liberal readers in the Russian Empire. And that was a common tactic for opposition newspapers of all stripes. The SRs had to do that. The Marxists, as we'll see, had to do that as well. Milyukov was a historian. He was a history professor at Moscow University, the most prestigious university in the Russian Empire. But he had lost his job there in the 1890s because of his outspoken liberal politics. He was sacked by the rector, the head of the university, at the order of the imperial government. And he was blackballed. He could not find any teaching jobs anywhere. So he went abroad for a couple of years, where he enjoyed a very solid reputation. He traveled to the United States. He taught for a time at the University of Chicago. He visited France and England, and everywhere Milyukov went, he was held up as this great reformer, this great figure, charismatic speaker, a terrific orator, a man who could turn crowds to his point of view. And if there was going to be liberal change in Russia, Milyukov was going to be the man to lead it. So he was the darling of liberals abroad. But the tragedy of the cadets is that their actual base of support in Russia was very, very small, for reasons that we'll talk about here in a minute. Milyukov and the liberals did not agree with the socialist revolutionaries. We are not going to get anywhere by throwing bombs, and honestly, we're not going to get anywhere by going out, scrubbing the faces of peasants, lifting them up out of poverty. We're going to get somewhere by looking to our base of support. The urban, educated professionals will rally them and push for the kind of change we want. Now, the liberals in Russia, maybe when we hear the word liberal today, it seems like a kind of wishy-washy or namby-pamby sort of term. To be a liberal in Russia in the early 20th century was a bold move that could bring arrest, imprisonment, exile down upon your head. And Milyukov was not soft on the autocracy. He was fond of saying there are no intermediary positions between autocracy and constitutionalism. What he meant was, we're not going to get anywhere by compromise. We're going to fundamentally change the existing system. We're going to topple the autocracy and bring in an elected government. So Milyukov and the liberals, if we think about their base of support, as we did for the SRs, the base of support for the liberals in Russia was very similar to the base of support that liberals across Europe enjoyed at this time. Russian liberals tended to be, like Milyukov himself, urban dwellers, city dwellers. They tended to be educated. They tended to come from the sort of middle class or better, or higher, if you will. And they tended to be very comfortable economically speaking. So if you think back to the demographic patterns we talked about last week, an empire with a population of 130 million, only 2 million of whom are living in the two largest cities, we're talking about a very small base of support for Milyukov's cadet party, for the Russian Liberal Party. Professionals, lawyers, doctors, teachers gravitate towards liberalism. It matches their own political grievances. But liberalism does not want to change the existing economic structures. While Milyukov and the cadets want to change the existing tyrannical structures of the autocratic political system, they're quite pleased with the current economic system of market capitalism. It benefits them quite well. So automatically, they are cutting off from their potential base of support huge swaths of the Russian population who have economic grievances. The liberal message is not going to appeal to peasants out in the countryside. As one Russian liberal put it, a constitution is a fine thing, but it means very little if you have no bread to feed your family. So those who are economically hurting in early 20th century Russia are not going to be attracted to the cadet party. And that's part of the tragedy of the cadets. They're a strong voice at the beginning of 1917, and they become completely marginalized by the end of that year. I want to hold off there and give you time to absorb what we've talked about, think about any of these issues. The next lecture that we're going to have this week is going to address the far left of the political spectrum in late Imperial Russia. We're going to talk about Marxism first in general terms, and then secondly, I want to talk about the reception of Marxism in Russia and how these two Marxist parties form, the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks. And we're going to spend more time talking about Russian Marxists because, not to give anything away, and I'm sure you already know this, right? It's the Marxists who win, if you will, in 1917. The SRs are losers in 1917, despite their great base of peasant support. The cadets, despite the power and eloquence of Milyukov, are also losers. So we're going to turn now to Marxism. Jot down your questions, think about anything that we want to talk about in more detail, and we will wrap up this lecture and move on to another one. So I will see you momentarily.